In other news, a deadline set by Russia for the last remaining defenders of Mariupol to, quote, lay down their arms in order to live has passed with no immediate response from Kiev. Russia's defense ministry said its troops had cleared the urban area of Mariupol and only a small contingent of Ukrainian fighters remained in the giant steelworks on Saturday. Quote, all who lay down their arms are guaranteed that their lives will be spared, the defense ministry said in a statement. Meanwhile, Volodymyr Zelensky warned that the, quote, extermination of the last Ukrainian defenders in Mariupol would put an end to any form of negotiations with Russia. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Mary Jajewski, who's a columnist on foreign affairs at The Independent, and Stathis Kalivas, Gladstone Professor of Government at the University of Oxford. Thank you both for joining me this afternoon. Firstly, I'll start with you, Mary. At this point in the conflict, what are Russia's aims?
Well, it seems to be becoming very, very confused because about a week or more ago, Russia said that it was really entering the second stage, what it called the second stage of its campaign, and that it was going to focus on the east. So it withdrew a lot of troops from the north and from around Kiev, and it appeared that that stage of the campaign was over. But it's actually become a lot more confused because rather than focusing exclusively on the east, we've seen additional strikes in the last few days, both in the vicinity of Kiev and out west in the vicinity of Lviv, and also just today in Mykolaiv, which is further to the west than Mariupol, which is where we've been talking about, where the Ukrainian forces there seem to be staging their last stand.
In your view, what are the options for Ukraine? I mean, the Ukrainians have shown, as many people have described, immense bravery in the face of an onslaught. But this is, of course, incredibly difficult to maintain, and it's seeing the destruction of their society. What do you think the options are for Ukrainian people now?
Well, I think there's actually a very, very difficult choice for President Zelensky and for Ukrainians, because there surely has to come a point where the loss is being sustained by Ukraine, and they are losing people. I think in the last couple of days, President Zelensky has given the between 2,000 and 3,000 Ukrainians have been killed so far, and there's been enormous destruction. We're not just looking at Mariupol, but damage in Kharkiv and in the towns near Kiev. That's going to, these are big losses for Ukraine, and it's going to have to decide. And President Zelensky, who has led this campaign from the beginning, from the front, he really has to decide at what point those losses become too much.
And Stathis Kalivas, Professor, what is your reaction?
My sense is that even though the losses are, as was just mentioned, enormous, there's no question that the Ukrainians don't have good options. They feel right now that they've spent tremendous effort and sustained tremendous destruction to achieve at least a partial victory north of Kiev. And on the other hand, if they were to submit to Russian demands right now, my sense is that they would feel that they've fought for nothing, that the war wouldn't necessarily end, that they would have to sacrifice a very large chunk of their country and be at the mercy of Russia. So they don't really have any good choice in front of them. My feeling is that the general sense among the Ukrainians is that the cost has to continue of this war until they at least manage to derive a good outcome out of this conflict. And my feeling is that they have the feeling that they can actually achieve something. There is a difference between the beginning of the war, when the sense was that the Ukrainian military was going to collapse almost in a matter of days, and where we are now, where there is a general feeling that they have a shot.
And Stathis, I mean, what do you think the West could be doing more? Of course, a lot of weapons and support have been provided financially and militarily and so on, but do you think more could be done to support the struggle of the Ukrainian people?
I think there are three things that the West can do. The first one is moral support, and there is tremendous moral support coming out of public opinion. Of course, as the war drags on and the costs of the conflict, especially in Western economies, escalate, there is a danger that this moral support may wane. We have to sustain it, I think. The second thing is additional military and financial support to the government. And the third thing is the sanctions have to be sustained, even though they're going to cost to the West as well.
And Mary, I mean, some people have expressed worry that because of the narrative within Russia that the Kremlin has pushed, that it has cultivated and unleashed some form of extreme nationalism within Russia with the narrative of denazification and so on. I mean, do you worry that even as the war continues, that something has been unleashed within Russia that will be very difficult to contain when it comes to their attitude towards the Ukrainian people?
I'm probably a bit more sanguine about that, because I think there's long been a strand of nationalism in Russia, which came to the fore, if you like, as the Soviet Union was collapsing. You know, the collapse of the Soviet Union was in part about a resurgent Russian nationalism against the other republics of the then Soviet Union. And that strand has remained. I'm not convinced that it's any significantly stronger now than it has been over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Certainly in the rhetoric from the Kremlin, there has been an attempt to raise the spectre of the Second World War victory, and all this talk of Nazis and denazification of Ukraine, as though the Ukrainian government was dominated and Ukraine generally was dominated by Nazis. I mean, this is complete. It's first of all not true. It's complete idiocy, but it's a myth that it has a certain degree of currency within Russia. But I think that you have to look at the other side as well. And what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, it's not, you couldn't say that it's a harmful or pernicious brand of nationalism. But what's happening is the establishment of a very, very strong and new national myth which opposes Ukraine to Russia. And on both sides, this is going to make even coexistence of those two states in the immediate future very, very difficult because of the enormous resentment and the new myths that have been built up on either side.
And finally, Seth, I want to get your reaction to what Mary has just said, but also, I mean, what do you say to those as well, that the position of the West in relation to Ukraine's accession into the EU and NATO is still unclear, that if that's something that the Ukrainians want in a referendum and so on, where it demonstrates that there is still strong support for that, there is still a decision for many Western leaders to make whether or not they would allow Ukraine into the European Union and NATO, and they've not been clear about their position on that. What's your thoughts, finally?
I would say that the two issues are perhaps different, that the question of the EU is easier to settle. There is going to be a process, hopefully after the conflict is over, where the Ukraine can actually negotiate the process of accession. It's probably also going to be related to a package of financial assistance for rebuilding Ukraine. NATO is a more sensitive issue, has to do with the whole defense architecture in the area. It was a very sensitive issue beforehand. It's been very discussed whether that was an issue that may perhaps triggered the Russians. But after this conflict is going to end, I'm very much on the same page with what was said, that we're going to look into a completely new situation. There's going to be certainly a lot of bitter feeling between Ukrainians and Russians, and certainly the Ukrainians would be in a good position, feeling that they have to make everything they can to ensure that this doesn't happen again in the future.
Thank you both for joining me this afternoon. Mary Dejevsky, columnist on Foreign Affairs at The Independent, and Stathis Kalivas, Gladstone Professor of Government at the University of Oxford. Thank you both very much.